Well, I'm super excited to be with you and to worship with you and to talk about Mark. Mark's always been my favorite book, although Luke has been sneaking up on it, so I got to get back into Mark and make sure it doesn't catch up. So we're going to spend most of my time in Mark 1, 16 to 20, and all that means in the Gospel of Mark and in the culture of the day and for us. And then when I get to the second text for this morning, from Mark 6, I'm almost done, like 2 minutes left. So if I get to the second text, you don't have to think I'm half done, right? Like I'm done. But we're going to start with Mark chapter 1, 16 through 20. Let me read the text. As Jesus walked beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. "Come, follow me," Jesus said, "and I will send you out to fish for people." At once they left their nets and followed him. When he had gone a little farther, he saw James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John in a boat preparing their nets. Without delay, he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired men and followed him. 4 men, going about their daily business, never suspecting that this would be the day that would send their lives in a completely new direction. And then Jesus comes along, draws near to them, invites them to leave all and follow him. Now, the first thing that astonishes me about this text is that Jesus is already calling disciples to follow him, and we're only 16 verses into the first chapter. Compare that to the other Gospels. That means that Mark has spent only 15 verses for, listen to this, all of the following: an introductory title, a bridge that he builds to the prophetic words of the Old Testament, everything he chooses to tell us about Jesus' birth and childhood, which is nothing, the entire ministry of John the Baptist, his baptizing, the meaning of it, the large following, his clothing, his diet, his witness to the Messiah, his prophetic words about the Spirit, and the baptism of Jesus. Then comes the entire narrative of Jesus' baptism, the voice from heaven, the Spirit coming down, then the temptation narrative, and then a summary of Jesus' ministry, where he says, the time has come, the kingdom has drawn near, repent and believe the good news. All of that in 15 verses. We're not even halfway through chapter 1, and Jesus is calling disciples. You kind of get a sense of Mark's priorities. This is all about Jesus calling disciples and sending them off in a mission. And we get to observe what happened back then and how Mark records it for us, so the same thing can happen here. That's the deal. So, I want to propose that the best way to explore this text is to ask 2 questions. We'll ask and answer the first, then we'll ask and re-ask the second. So question 1, to what are people called when Jesus calls them? And question 2, from what are people called when Jesus calls them? So let's start with the first one and explore how our text, this first text, answers that question for us. So the first answer to the question, to what does Jesus call us, is in the very first word of Jesus. Come. Come to me. So what's the first answer? Jesus calls us first and foremost to a relationship. That's the bottom line if we want to follow Jesus, a relationship with Jesus himself. Jesus doesn't call us first and foremost to a new way of life, or to an assignment, or to a religious experience, or to a new set of rules about how to live life, or to a future in heaven. Jesus calls us to himself. That's how it all begins. Jesus initiates, Jesus invites, Jesus accepts us exactly the way we are. There can't be any discipleship if there isn't first a relationship. And discipleship can't be maintained if there isn't a relationship. So, first answer, to what does Jesus call us? To a relationship. Now, the problem is some people think that's the whole answer. We're done. We're in a relationship with Jesus, except there's 3 more answers. Number 2, it's to discipleship. It's to following. So the very next words of Jesus, come, follow me. These 4 men were not called to settle down there on the beach and enjoy a private relationship with Jesus. They were called to begin a journey, to literally follow. Jesus would lead them into new places, new activities, new adventures, new mission. That's what discipleship is. It's learning to follow. So every time Jesus calls someone to a relationship, he always calls them to discipleship and to follow. But that's not the end of the story either. Sometimes we get those 2 parts right, and then we forget that the next line is, I will send you out to fish for people. Or to translate it more literally, I will train you to become those who can fish for people. So the third answer is to mission, or to ministry, if you like. We're called to relationship, we're called to discipleship, and we're called into ministry. Now, the church has found a clever way of making sure that only a few people feel called by taking this expression, called to ministry, and thinking that it really means called into full-time Christian service, or to become a missionary overseas, or to be a Bible teacher, or whatever they think it means. But that's not what it means. It means Jesus called you to a relationship, Jesus called you to discipleship, and therefore Jesus calls us all into ministry. That's part of the same call for everyone. Now, some people get some sort of special call to certain things, but that can happen to anything. To become a math teacher, to become a nurse, to become a childcare worker. So we go through life discerning what kind of gifts have we been given, where is Jesus giving us opportunities, what kind of feedback are we getting, and we are called into specific places. But every one of us, just like Simon and Andrew, James and John, if we're called to relationship and discipleship, then we are called to ministry. And then there's a fourth answer. We've run out of words, though, haven't we? Come, follow me, I will make you fish for people. That's the end of Jesus' sentence. So what's the fourth answer? And I'm going to say it's community. Because Jesus didn't come to have a private relationship, a private discipleship, and a private mission for Simon, and then another one for Andrew and James and John. He's building a community. So he calls 2 brothers, and he calls 2 more to join them. And as we keep reading, more and more join this growing community. And then eventually he chooses 12 to become an inner circle of this community. Jesus is creating a community. You see, we don't get to decide whether we want to get along with the people next to us. Lord, I'll follow you, I'll go on a mission for you, but I don't want to deal with this guy. Jesus says, you don't get to decide. And if 4 fishermen might wonder if they can get along, just wait till tax collectors join the group, and zealots. You see, the call to relationship and discipleship and ministry is a call to become part of that community that Jesus is building that ultimately will change the world. And when we say yes to Jesus, we're saying 4 yeses. Because those are the 4 questions he asks. So, all of that I suggest is what we're called to. But now let's ask the second important question. What are we called from? Well, I think this text provides us some pretty interesting answers, especially if we pay attention to what this text means in a first century Galilean world. And then if we ask, and how does Mark actually tell us this story? So let's get going on the second question. From what does Jesus call us? Well, they were called to leave everything, like all. In fact, I heard someone say once, it doesn't actually cost much to follow Jesus. Just one thing, that's all. Just all, that's the only thing. But what does this all include? Well, for Simon and Andrew and James and John, it was their boats and their nets and their profession and their family and their village, and you can think of all the things that go along with that. But let's be clear how radical that would have been in their world, even more so than in ours. So think about family relationships. First of all, most of us eventually leave home. We still have 2 adult sons who haven't quite done it yet, but they're going to get there. Some people leave when they go off to college, move into your own apartment. Maybe you move to a new city, new state, new country. Some people leave already when they finish high school, at the latest when you graduate, take up a career. Well, if not then, at least when you get married, you move out, right? Not then. Not back then. Back then, all children, even married children, would live either with parents or step-parents. Parents-in-law, I should say. Because that's the only place to live. Like, you live where you grew up. And if there isn't room in the house, you build another one in the backyard. Parents and children would see each other every single day, pretty much all day, every single day, especially if you're working together in the family business, as these people obviously were. So they left behind in a much more radical sense than when we move out of our parents' house into our own apartment. And what about leaving the boats and the fishing nets? These 4 men had never learned any other skill or trade, just the one that their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents had always practiced. They were fishermen because they were born to a fisherman's family. You don't choose your career. Your life is kind of pre-programmed because of who gave you birth. In our world, it's not at all unusual if you're 20 years old and you have zero idea what kind of career you want to pursue. Go to college and you change majors 3 times. And then you take a different career than you studied for, maybe. You might start out as a, factory worker or farm worker, or get a bit more schooling, become a teacher, maybe a school administrator, and then when you finally have a nice pension, then you quit and you start selling real estate, or whatever. Or you could think of a million other configurations. Not back then. You didn't choose your career, you didn't change your career. So when Jesus calls them to leave the fishing business, that's a pretty tough choice. Were they really willing to leave the only career they had ever learned, the only possible source of a reliable income that they had ever imagined, the security that they expected for their future, their identity, to start all over in a new life, in a new family, with a new career, and a new sort of security altogether following Jesus? Yeah, I guess it doesn't cost much to follow Jesus, does it? Just one thing, that's all. That's all. So, now I've asked the question one way. What did these 4 men leave? But now I want to ask the question differently. And if you have a text in front of you, you might want to look at it while I ask the question. What does Mark say they left behind? It's pretty clear they left their village, right? Because Jesus walks away. But the text doesn't say they left their village. It's also pretty clear they must have left their boats. Pretty hard to drag them along the road. But Mark doesn't say they left their boats either. What does Mark say they left behind? First of all, Simon and Andrew left their nets. So, leave the nets, take the boats? No. Left everything, family, village, boats, business. But he says they left their nets. And then we get to the second set of brothers, and it says they left their Father. Oh, did they take the nets along? No, they left everything. Everybody left everything. But Simon and Andrew left their nets, and James and John left their father, says the text. Now, maybe just a coincidence, right? Mark just had to tell the story somehow, and he came up with this. I don't think so. I want you to consider with me what we know about these four people. We actually know the most about Simon, Peter, and John, but their brothers are part of that too. So what do we know about them? Let's start with Simon Peter. I'm going to give him a nickname here, a different one than Jesus gave him. Jesus called him the Rock. I'm going to call him the Net Man. Because he's the fisherman par excellence. I'm going to guess he was a committed, competent, competitive fisherman, probably a great leader in the fishing business of his day, ready to yell and swear at the competition. When people stand in his way, he pushes them aside. When he doesn't agree, he just contradicts them. So how do we know that? Because he even does it to Jesus. Whatever Peter does, he does with all his might. Whatever he says with conviction, usually putting his foot in his mouth, actually. He's kind of a natural leader. When he doesn't know what to say, he just blurts out something. We get this marvelous story in Mark chapter 9, where they're on the mountain of transfiguration, and Peter says, hey, let's build up 3 tents here. And then Mark, the author, puts in little brackets, he didn't know what to say. So when Peter doesn't know what to say, what does he do? He just starts talking. So that's Peter. Whatever he does with all his might. So remember the time that Jesus was having a conversation about taxes, and one of the disciples wanted to know if we have to pay taxes and all that kind of stuff. And so he sends somebody to go fishing, to catch a fish, and take the coin from the fish's mouth and pay the tax. So who did he send? Come on, you know who it is. Peter. Peter's the guy he sends fishing. Remember after the resurrection, when Jesus wasn't showing up quite as often anymore, and Peter finally gets impatient, and what does he say? I think I'm going home to mom and dad. No. I'm going fishing, says Peter. He takes 6 others along with him. And when Jesus finally does have these guys fish for people, like he said he was going to, it's Peter who casts the big net on the day of Pentecost and catches 3,000. That's Peter. He's the net man. Now think about John. Actually, here we know that James is just as much like this. These are completely relational-oriented people. Most of the time, they're not even called James and John. What are they called? The sons of Zebedee. Everybody knew about their close relationship with their parents. In fact, one time even their mother got involved, coming up to Jesus, asking for special favor for her 2 boys. And guess what the text calls her? The mother of the sons of Zebedee. Like, this is a totally enmeshed family. These are not net men. These are daddy's boys. And what does John call himself in his own gospel? The disciple whom Jesus loved. Peter would have called himself the disciple that Jesus sent fishing. And what does John say over and over and over again, not only in the gospel, but in all of his letters? Love one another. There's actually an old legend that John, on his deathbed, would receive visitors, and the only words he had left to speak were, love one another. John's a relational guy. All right, now we come back to the original question. Why would Mark write, Simon and Andrew left their nets, James and John left their father? See, I expect that Simon and his brother Andrew would have found it much easier to leave their village and their family if a new adventure called. But do we really have to leave our nets? Our identity as fishermen? And with James and John, the opposite was true. If a new relationship requires it, of course I can leave my nets and my boats. But do I really have to say goodbye to mom and dad? So Mark writes, Simon and Andrew left their nets, even their nets, to follow Jesus. James and John left their father, even their father, to follow Jesus. Even that, which would almost have held their hearts too tightly, even that they were willing to leave behind to follow Jesus. Even that which would have been the hardest to let go of. Because the cost of discipleship is even that. So these are incredibly amazing beginning disciples. But the text raises really tough questions too. Like for me, what would be my that? What's that which would almost prevent me from saying yes to Jesus? And then, of course, the next question, does it really cost that to follow Jesus? Like, really? So here's where we read texts in context. A casual reading of this text could easily give the impression that these four men are leaving home and village and career and identity, not to mention nets and boats, for the very last time, never to see any of those things again. But if that's what we imagine, what a surprise awaits us as we keep on reading in Mark's gospel and discover, still within the very first chapter, in fact, less than 10 verses later, that Simon and Andrew are back in their own home, enjoying a Sabbath dinner with their family. And when we get to chapter 3, verse 9, they're back in the boats. In fact, they're back in the boats again in chapter 4 and chapter 5 and chapter 6 and chapter 8. So I thought they left the boats behind. Well, sure, but that doesn't mean they can't use them. You see, they belong to Jesus, and Jesus says, get back in the boat. So they got back in the boat. In fact, when we leave everything to follow Jesus, Jesus usually gives it all back, except now it actually belongs to him. And so he gets to tell us what to do with all of it. So what does Jesus do with those boats? Well, he's pretty creative. Sometimes they're a platform from which he preaches. Sometimes they're used for transportation back and forth across the lake to pursue his ministry. Sometimes it becomes a sort of classroom where he's teaching his disciples some of the tougher lessons of discipleship. And the Lord will find very creative ways of using whatever you give him, and he hands back to you. So apparently, leaving everything doesn't normally mean that they're all taken away from us and we'll never see them again. It just means that the one who has become our Lord now has also become the Lord of everything else about us. All we have, all we do. Now, one more point, and then we're going to get to the second text, and then we're almost done. So these disciples, they begin amazingly, wonderfully, a model beginning, right? They just leave everything to follow Jesus. So you kind of expect that from now on, they're going to be model disciples teaching us exactly how to follow Jesus, right? Well, for whatever reason, Mark has decided to pull the rug out from under our expectations. And instead of portraying perfect models from here on, we get a bunch of blundering tag-alongs who get almost everything wrong. So let me illustrate that by just taking snapshots of the first 3 things that any of these disciples say to Jesus in Mark. Okay. So the first time it happens, it's in chapter 1, verse 36 and 37. Jesus has just become famous overnight, actually over day and then overnight. So on the Sabbath, he's teaching in the synagogue, and people are amazed at his authority, and he drives out a demon, and they're amazed at his authority, and he leaves the synagogue, and he heals Simon's mother-in-law, and when the sun goes down, because now the Sabbath is over, and then all the pious people, notice Jesus wasn't one of them, they now can carry the sick and bring them to Jesus, and so he heals them, and he's famous. And what does he do the next morning? He quietly leaves the village Goes to a private place to pray and says, I'm going to go to other villages now. That's his plan. Except that's not the plan of Simon and his companions, as they're called. No, it's Simon and his companions, the guy who always steps out first. He gets out there and actually Mark says they hunted him down. It's a really strong word. If you're looking at your NIV, it says went to look for him or something like that. The word is katadioko. It's what you would use if you were hunting for deer or something. You shoot a bow and arrow and the deer is running away and you're not going to let it get away. So that's the word that's used. They're pursuing him with all their might. And when they get there, they say, I'll paraphrase, what in the world are you doing out here in a lonely place? Don't you know that you're famous overnight? Get back in the village. And Jesus says, I think it's your priorities that are all wrong, not mine. So the first thing the disciples say to Jesus is, you got the wrong priorities. And the second thing they say happens when they're crossing the lake in a boat, their boat. And there's a storm. And they come to Jesus and say, Teacher, don't you care if we drown? In other words, you're a really terrible group leader. Get up and do something. And then the third thing they say to him happens when a woman worms her way through a crowd. She's unclean. She touches the hem of Jesus' garment. Jesus feels that healing has gone out from him. And he says, who touched me? And the disciples say, Jesus, you really ask stupid questions, don't you? Like everybody's crowding against you. So there you have it. Jesus, your priorities are all wrong. You're a terrible group leader, and you ask really stupid questions. Those are the first three things that these guys say to Jesus. And then it starts going downhill. Like I already quoted the stupid proposal that Peter makes on the Mountain of Transfiguration. They fail to understand almost everything Jesus says. They argue about who's the greatest. They chase away parents who are trying to bring their children to Jesus. They try to shut down a deliverance ministry because the person driving out demons isn't part of their group. They petition Jesus for places of honor at his left and his right. Near the end of the gospel, they finally start to catch on, and then they run away because that's not what they bargained for, except for Peter. He sticks around just a little longer so he can deny Jesus 3 times, and then he disappears as well. This is the story Mark tells about these disciples who began so well. They fail over and over and over again. And right in the middle of all these failures, we read this, and now our second text for this morning. Calling the 12, he began to send them out 2 by 2 and gave them authority over impure spirits. These were his instructions: take nothing for the journey except a staff, no bread, no bag, no money in your belts. Wear sandals, but not an extra tunic. Whenever you enter a house, stay there until you leave that town. And if any place will not welcome you or listen to you, leave that place and shake the dust off your feet as a testimony against them. Now get this. They went out and preached that people should repent. They drove out many demons and anointed many sick people with oil and healed them. Who was it that did all those things? Carefully screened, educated, trained seminary students who had learned all the basics of discipleship and become very mature? No. It was these blundering, misunderstanding disciples. Right in the middle of it, he sends them out on the mission, and in the authority of Jesus, they just do exactly what Jesus wanted them to do. They thought Jesus had it all wrong. Wrong priorities, bad leadership, asking dumb questions. Actually, all along, they were the ones whose priorities were all wrong. They were disasters at following, let alone leading, and they were asking all the wrong questions. And precisely these people are authorized by Jesus to do whatever he did. And what did they do? They just obeyed, and they went, and they told people the good news, and they healed them, and they delivered them. And that's the bottom line of today's text. Jesus is empowering every one of us, you and me, and sending us forth to share the good news in word and deed, and will use us far more than we can imagine. If only we say yes to Jesus and hand over the control of our life to Jesus and go forth in his name, no matter how badly and how often we get it all wrong. And that's good news.